So it's always uh, interesting to hear all the different perspectives. But I'm going to talk about a little bit more of the technical side of the Wildbook project from the computer vision machine learning side. And what I'm actually going to talk about is a bit of our vision for the future, the next generation of the algorithms. And this vision and insight has come through a lot of hard work, in the sense of every time we create some new idea, we think about new ways to use it and scare the tar out of ourselves, and then figure out how to do it on the fly. So the rallies, starting with the Great Zebra Count in Nairobi National Park, and I think it was 2015, to the Great Grevy's Rally that Dan and Tanya talked about in 2016, 18, and 20. We've made up, in the process of analyzing that data, we've come up with new ideas, but implementing some on the fly, implementing some manually. But we've now stepped back and really thought about what the problems really are, and how we want to approach them and how we want to organize our system. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And from the point of view of publications, this is perhaps a few months premature, but in the spirit of a workshop and also just wanting to get things going, I'm doing what they used to tell you not to do, which is talk about your new work. So Wildbook, Tanya's given a good overview. There's a large team. The conceptual ideas came through Tanya, Dan, myself, and Jason Holmberg, who is executive director of WildMe. And in the bottom left corner, you see 3 of my PhD students. The middle one, Jason Parham, will be graduating soon. If you go to the WildMe website, you'll see these 8 people, and you'll notice upper right corner, that's also Jason Parham, and center left is Jason Holmberg. But they've recruited a team. Some of these people are user interface people, some of them are ecologists, and some of them are machine learning people. Okay, so let's take a look at the ideal scenario of the problem. The problem is we have a picture of an animal and we want to know who it is. So in the ideal scenario, we have this pre-curated database where every one of those pictures has a label that says who it is, as Tanya says, Zippy the zebra. So the ideal scenario is you go launch a query, you have some machine learning computer vision algorithm, and out pops a single answer. And the nice thing about this particular example is it popped out a picture, and this is in fact correct, of the animal at a much younger age. And there are some applications where this scenario comes close. So this is an example of the North Atlantic right whale. There's in the neighborhood of 600 to 700 of them. And they launched a Kaggle competition maybe 3 years ago. And the winning team was the algorithm called Deep Sense. And the way it worked was they wrote feature detectors that got the tip of the nose and the blowhole, and as you can see in red and blue in the upper left. And then they oriented and scaled the images. And then they ran a deep learning model where the model had one classifier per known individual, and it produced winning results. And that software has actually been incorporated into the Wildbook system. But this assumes you know every animal, and it needs to be retrained for each new individual in the catalog, and is not good for a fairly dynamic set of individuals. Let me see. The worst case, and this is the case we've actually faced with pictures of zebras in Kenya, is you get this enormous pile of images and you have to make sense of it. You have to figure out who's there, and which pictures show the same animal, while trying not to make too many mistakes. So I'm going to talk about this process today. And PowerPoint is not responding. There we go. So I'm going to spend some time talking about this question. Why isn't this just an application of recognition technology like face identification? And if you look at face identification versus more standard recognition algorithms, one of the major differences simply is in the pre-processing to orient faces. And when you have enough training data, you can limit the amount of orientation that you need to actually apply. So why isn't this just an application of that technology? So the key ideas are illustrated in the next few slides. The first one is your training set, except for some very charismatic species, tend to be small. You don't have a lot of individuals that you've pre-identified. And you get a steady stream of images, and each image could show a new individual, and of course you don't actually know whether or not the individual is new. So the small training sets and a steady stream of images. So it's an open world recognition problem. The next case is some animals are rarely seen. So this is a graph of the sightings of the Grevy's zebra on the right and plain zebra on the left from the great zebra and giraffe count in Nairobi National Park, where we counted plain zebras, and in the GGR efforts where we've counted Grevy zebras. And you can see the most common of the histogram. This is the number of times. So across the bottom is the number of sightings, and up the vertical axis is the number of individuals. So most individuals were actually seen only once. And when you look at longer term data, which I actually wish I had a histogram, we have some longer term data over 15 or 20 years of whale sharks. And the histogram actually peaks at 2. Whereas if you look at a lot of the training data sets for recognition, the bottoms, the rare sightings are considered to 15 to 20, and most have 30, 40, 50, 100 or more sightings of each individual. And of course, as everybody who's worked in machine learning knows, that data dominates. So the algorithms themselves are imperfect. So this is the third concern. And so what this means is, instead of querying and prepping out one individual and being sure it's right, you usually get, and this is the classic way object recognition algorithms work, you get a set of ranked candidates. They could be these ranked annotations, or they could be clustered by candidate individuals. But you are given a set of candidates, and the humans then have to make decisions. And of course, it could be ensemble decisions based on humans, but the important point here is that humans actually have to make those decisions. So what kind of decisions could humans make? Humans are not very good at recognizing. They're not good at saying who this particular turtle is, in this example. They're good at saying, are these two pictures showing the same turtle? And I have to apologize for the yellow. The yellow is the highlighted region of similarity based on the actual algorithms we use. So people are good at looking at two pictures side by side and saying yes or no, those are the same animal, which is called a verification task. They're not very good at looking at a picture of a turtle and saying who it is, or any other animal. So what's the implication of this? Whoops, we don't need to look at Boris yet. The implication of this, if you think about it, if you're given a picture of 1,000 different individuals, and all you can ask is, are these the same or are they different? Sorting them is on the order of 1 million comparisons. Technically, it's 500,000, but still, it's a square of the number of annotations you have if you're just doing it blindly, asking the yes or no, are these the same questions? Whereas most times you're looking at data from, when you're doing training data, you're asking questions about individual images, like placing bounding boxes or tracing outlines. And while the tracing of outlines is a lot of work, it's work that's done on a single image rather than work done by comparing many images at a time, over many pairs. So this really hampers the ability to generate training data sets. Also, this is sort of a fun example that you would kind of expect, but if you look at the generation of a lot of training data sets, they're based on metadata. So that you scrape data with ID with pictures and the associated metadata that this is UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And of course, the public data sets, like the ones out of Oxford in the early 2015 and the ones out of University of Washington, all use public figures. So you scrape data, you get the ID, and of course the private data sets, they're held by Microsoft or by Facebook and Google, which have hundreds of millions of pictures of faces, are based on their internal information. And there's no such metadata available for most species of animals. The next thing is that mistakes will occur and they must be found and fixed. So here are 4 pictures. They're actually taken fairly similar, relatively closely spaced in time, but we handled over years. But there's actually a mistake here. And so the way we can find and fix this mistake, well, there's a number of ways, but here's the basic idea. And we'll come back to this more. If we introduce an additional image through a query and it matches one image, we can then look and see, does it match the others? And it turns out in this particular case, we have to do more exploration of the data that we already have. And we find a conflict between these 2 images that allows us to decide that these are in fact 2 different animals. But you have to have your system structured in such a way is that query images can produce changes in your database and changes in the identity of animals. And this happens to us with every data set that we actually have. The rough numbers we've heard are about 97% accuracy, but it takes working with biologists and conservationists who have built up these catalogs. You have to actually convince them that there are mistakes in this catalog. So you actually have to present the errors and the data. Really super important problem. You can't ID every animal you see. In this particular, these 2 images, you might be able to identify the zebra on the left and the baby zebra on the front right. But the other 3, you have almost no chance of identifying. And if you tried to identify them, you'd end up with either extra work. Well, you would end up with a lot of extra work that would be potentially fruitless, or you'd make mistakes and falsely classify an individual as new when you may have seen them previously. And this leads to the last one, which is there's a trade-off among accuracy, completeness, and human effort. And so in this particular case, when we show these 2 cropped pictures of the right side of a Grevy zebra, this is about as easy as it comes. You can very quickly see that these are different animals. But when you're looking at pictures that look like this, where you have on, say, the right, you have the animal that's blurry and this hip region is hard to see. You have a partial view of the zebra in the center and only a little bit view of the back of the zebra on the left. And so maybe you have some incomplete information by trying to identify these zebra, but you reduce the amount of human effort, especially because automated algorithms are less likely to be able to pull out the zebra correctly and give you the right answer. And then this may be a trade-off among accuracy, against accuracy. So one of the results we have coming very soon is that by actually being more selective in our data, we actually do not give up accuracy, which is an exciting result and a big part of Jason Parham's PhD and forthcoming paper. Okay, so this leads us to the summary, what we call the continual curation problem. And this is, the components of this remain to be a work in progress. So I'll explain some of the components briefly as I go, but the basic idea is we have a continual input of images that start from an often small initial ID training set. For each new image, we may include new animals that have to be discovered. They can lead to discovery and correction of previous mistakes. They require a series of algorithmic guided human decisions. And by algorithmic guided, I mean the algorithms select where questions need to be asked. They could cause algorithms to update themselves in terms of IDs and also lead to retraining. And just before I get into the details of some of these ideas, please note that the current production version of Wildbook does not include what I'm going to talk about on, I meant to put this on a different spot. Oh, well. I'm going to talk about verification and automatic decision-making, and Wildbook currently does not include it, but the experimental analysis we're doing for the Great Grevy's Rally data does. So Tanya showed this a little bit, but the first part of the system is detection and filtering. So you have the input images, you have to figure out which species are shown in the images. And of course, in the conservancies in Kenya, there are often multiple species. You have to place a bounding box around each and classify each species. Then you have to classify viewpoint. We have a coarse segmentation, which will soon be a much finer segmentation. And then we have what we call a census annotation, which is a focus down on the animals that might actually be identifiable. So let me talk about that a little bit. So if I look at these two pictures of a Grevy zebra, it's, if you know what you're really looking for, you can figure out that they're actually different, but they show much different regions. In terms of identifiable information, the one on the right shows the chevron on the front shoulder, and the one on the left shows the back, and they don't show much overlapping information. So you have to be able to tell and decide whether or not you can identify an animal. Yes, I might be able to identify this individual on the left by seeing another picture of the animal that shows its whole body or its whole right side. But if these are the only two pictures I have and it were the same animal, I couldn't actually tell whether or not they were the same. And so I might actually create two individuals. So I have to be very, very careful about what it is that's identifiable. So the new concept we've come up with is this notion of a census annotation. This is an annotation that if I see it and I have a reasonable shot at it, I can decide for any other census annotation whether or not it's the same animal. And so the decision we made, and we made it on the fly during the 2018 analysis, is that it had to show both the hip and the chevron. And so those are the regions that are highlighted in green. Currently, we can automatically classify with very high precision what annotations in fact qualify as a census annotation. And we can also limit the scope of our view to the regions in red, which actually show the highlighted regions. So I've already said this, basically any pair of census annotations must be comparable to any other census annotation. This does not mean that you have a unique set of census annotations or a unique single type of annotation for each animal. So for example, we could limit ourselves just to the hip and then we'd expand our set of annotations, but we do this for completeness and accuracy. So then we move on to the identification stage, and we're going to talk about three stages. The first one is the one we've already talked about, which is search and ranking, and that's where most identification processes stop. But we're also going to talk about verification, for which both algorithmic and human, and then how the actual decision process is managed. So we've got three types of algorithms in our system for search and ranking. There's actually 7 or 8 that are being used by Wildbook, but they fall into 3 classes. The first class is that there's no machine learning at all. None. So this can work from starting from no data at all. And what we have here are very classic key point extraction and descriptor matching algorithms. So if you go back and really build off the techniques of the SIFT-based descriptors or key points and descriptors and all the modern improvements to that, you end up with, and combine it with some more recent search techniques, you end up with a hotspotter algorithm. And you've seen these pictures in Dan and Tanya's talks, and this is what Dan said. What's highlighted and matched between the 2 images are the distinctive regions, and that's where Dan called them the hotspots, and that's where the name hotspotter came from. The second class of algorithm is deep learning to extract matchable features from single images. So in other words, we have 2 types of algorithms. One is a spot detector, which is kind of in its is both the oldest and the newest algorithm. We have a much older version that we're rewriting and training on a deep learning methods. But the more advanced version, the more production use, is based on tracing curves on species. And we've done various types of dolphins, sharks. So we've done fins and flukes and ears. And the cool thing about this is you do not have to generate a precise outline of the features. What you have to do is paint a very broad brush that says it's here. And then we synthesize training data for the boundaries. So that's the actual cool insight of the algorithm. But for our purposes, the important idea here is that we are extracting information from individual pictures that we have no idea who their match is. So it's training, we're back to the sort of the single image training. And then the more popular modern method is, if you have enough training data, we can use deep learning to train embeddings. And this is the algorithm that's most in use, called pose invariant embedding. There's a lot of, the cool idea here is it's a lot of augmentation. But we've been able to replicate this algorithm with other approaches, to other deep learning approaches. So the next question is moving beyond ranking. So the ranking algorithm tends to produce some number of candidates. And what we do is we turn those candidates into graphs. So here you can see the query in the center and the candidates. Each candidate forms an edge in the graph. And these graphs get merged into the previous graph we have for these annotations already in our database. And we also weight the edges according to the results of verification. And verification, we have two forms. One is an algorithmic form that classifies whether or not two animals might be different, and this produces a negative weight. Whether or not it's hard to tell, and we try to avoid this with census annotations, so we have relatively few of those, or they're the same. So we have two versions of this. One is based on a random forest classifier, and the other is based on a deep network. And then we also have the ability to make humans to make decisions, and humans make the same decision, same, different, or cannot tell. So the last step is, how do we actually use this? And this is back to, this is very new work, but it's very promising, and it's in the process of being, the experiments are done, and it's process of being written up. So this is, again, the example I had earlier, where I have a mistake. And so I get a query annotation that comes in, and I get this positive connection. And I want to go and check that connection to make sure I actually trust it. So I may actually search and look at the other animals that this is connected to, or the other annotations that it's connected to. And I might ask a query about these other two individuals, or the other two annotations. And if that query comes back positive from the verification algorithm, and I try automatic verification first, then I say, great, I've got this zebra that we'll call zebra A.
Chuck, 5 minutes.
Okay, great. So what happens if this query comes back negative? Now I've got a problem. I've got the zebra on the picture on the right showing that it thinks the algorithms think the bottom right zebra is the same, but there's a conflict that the group that it's a part of, and these are clustering algorithms, are different. So I have to go and ask more information. And the way I do that is I look at which are the two alternative clusters. And the alternative clusters are the upper left 3 are the same and the lower right 2 are the same, or that the one on the right is by itself. And that really centers around this particular zebra and this particular annotation. So what I do is, and I issue more queries against the verification algorithms, and I ask these two whether or not they're the same. And that question, because I don't have a connection yet, is asked of the algorithmic verification. And I also, at the same time, might go back to this one. And since I already have a connection, that's where I go back to the humans. And similar with that. And I then come back, and with negative information, a positive connection there, and maybe negative by the human that overrides the algorithm. Now I've got enough information that I might actually say these are two separate zebras. and I effectively break them up into 2 clusters. So this is what we call the local clustering and alternatives algorithm, because I generated 2 alternatives clusterings and I looked for the inconsistencies across them and then asked questions. Those questions are asked first of the algorithm if the verification algorithm hasn't been run. And if it has been run, I go and ask the human observer. So what's next? Where are we going? Well, we have continual curation is the problem that statement is really driving the research agenda. Ranking is constantly in a problem that needs improvement. We're working at self-supervision. One of the things I didn't mention is we're looking at learned features like the ear outline, but also more traits and attributes. Markings, scarrings, loss of tusks, holes in ears, all sorts of things. And that's work that we're starting with Sarah Beery and her team at Caltech. Of course, transfer learning. We've already gotten some success in this, that the curve rank seems to be producing a generic model of a fin and a fluke, and we've been able to apply this across species. And of course, blended algorithms, and the blending is going through this local clustering and annotation or alternative algorithms. Very important to generate and continue to generate explanatory capabilities. Hotspotter has them, curve rank has them, other algorithms are a little lacking. Verification needs to be continued to be improved. And again, the clustering and ID decision-making has to work at a large scale. And the holy grail is bootstrapping a population or even a species with limited human intervention. But I will say that we're about to be able to show that the months of work in curating the 2016 and 2018 Grevy's rally data is will be down to just a few days. Thank you. So I'll leave that up for questions.
Let's clap again. You were muted here. Thank you so much, Chef.
Thank you.
Any questions? Anybody here from the room? Yeah, we have Ron.
Hi.
Chuck, thank you for this interesting talk. You mentioned that you have specific compulsory regions in the image for census annotation.
Yes.
And it seems to me it's a privilege of the rich.
It's a privilege of the rich in some respects, yes.
So if you don't have as many good images, say your subject is photographed at night and then only part of it is lighted, and images are not as uniform in quality, is it possible to tune the algorithm to give you maybe a lower bound and upper bound for the number of individuals in your population based on fewer such compulsory regions?
I'm going to try to answer that in a couple of ways. One thing is, I think we can separate the notion of, you could have multiple compulsory regions. And so, for example, I could, let me rephrase that. You can work with multiple compulsory regions and they don't even have to be the same. Again, this is in principle. So I could say have compulsory regions that are right front, the hip and chevron on the right, the hip and chevron on the left. And I could match using those, discover that I have those regions and match. What I have to be careful of is making population estimates based on the fact that I saw, or classifying 2 different annotations as different individuals if I saw the front shoulder of one and the back hip of the other. So you can mix and match what you're actually allowed to identify and try to match in the identification algorithm. But when you interpret your results, you have to restrict your attention to just the regions, what's consistent, because you can't say, I've seen the left side and the right side, but therefore they're different animals.
All right, I see Kevin, Zoom, is a question?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. I was curious what the upper limit on the population size these techniques work for. So like with the Grevy zebra, you mentioned there are only a few thousand in the world, which sounds like a lot of individuals to keep track of. And then with the other zebras, it seems like there are many, many more. And so
Correct.
again, it seemed like that would pose, at some point, I'm just curious, when does it become infeasible to keep track of that many individuals?
It depends on the distinctiveness of the individual and on very technical algorithmic issues. I think for the Grevy zebra, there is very, interestingly, because it's very much like a fingerprint, I don't think there's that much limit to it. And one of the ways to handle the technical aspects of that are to gradually transition from feature-based algorithms to deep learning algorithms as you have enough information about particular individuals, so hybrid algorithms. Because as we know, feature-based algorithms, the traditional tend to be for large memory, have large memory requirements. We haven't hit the upper limit yet. My sense is that with plain zebras, since the regions that make them distinctive are fewer, in order to scale up, we'd have to be even more selective about which images we actually select. But I think eventually, depending on the species, the level of distinctiveness, it will top out. And it will top out very small in some species. Species that are fairly cryptic, that have very subtle distinctions on their faces, it'll top out at a much lower level. And we don't have the experimental data to explain that thoroughly.
All right, thank you once again.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
We now must move to our next speaker, and Ofer is going to present the next speaker.